Hello, Sergeants Major. This is Sergeant Major Jason Leeworthy, coming at you again to talk a little bit about moral and ethical reasoning, and hopefully to help you shape your ethics essay. And some of the stuff might apply to your capstone as well. The goal here is to give you some different ideas, different thoughts, different lenses that you can think about and use as you write your ethics essay. Few disclaimers. Of course, this is not an official Army video. Again, this is just Jason Leeworthy trying to help you out a little bit and get you on track and get you thinking about different things. Also, we'll be talking about some different issues and different sides of issues. Again, just to help you in your analysis, how to think about these. Some of these will be controversial. People get very emotional, very heated sometimes about discussing them. But again, if I make a statement, please don't assume that's necessarily my point of view. It's just to help you understand how people see things differently and to help you to be able to think critically about these ethical issues that you're going to write about. I want to make one other statement about when I sent you the initial email. Some of you may have read that I do have an undergraduate degree and a master's degree in religious studies. Please know that when you write your paper, I'm not looking for, conformity to my worldview, or, my expectation is not that you write about, theism or anything like that if you're an atheist or agnostic or whatever the case may be. I'm only evaluating your paper based on, whatever your starting assumptions are, and is your paper logical, and is it flow, and are you talking specifically about the issue that you're addressing? So again, please know that I'm not looking for conformity to my personal worldview. You will not be evaluated on that. I got an email from a student asking if there was a topic list. No, there is not a specific topic list, but we do want you to write about an ethical issue, okay? Something that's dealing with morality, not morale, okay? If, morale is like, are the soldiers happy, and are they feeling loved, and is there enough, ice cream in the chow hall or whatever? That's not what we're looking for, okay? We're talking about ethical issue, good and bad, right and wrong, just versus unjust, those types of things. I want to talk to you a little bit about why is this important at all? What is the application after you get out of this course? So a key thing that we're trying to help you develop is that you can look objectively at an issue, a controversial issue. Maybe it's in relationship to UCMJ, or somebody's accused of this or that, and avoid rushing to judgment, okay, without the facts, without the evidence, without thinking through the issue. I'll give you a personal example here because it relates directly to my point. When I was a first sergeant, I had a soldier that was accused of sleeping with another soldier's wife, and that soldier was off in Ranger School. And my sergeant major he had already drawn his conclusion, hadn't heard my soldier's side of the story, but he had already made up his mind that this soldier was guilty. So soldier was charged, brought in for UCMJ, and there was no evidence that could be presented, that he had actually done this thing he was accused of. And there was another soldier that was with my soldier at the time. They were both in my unit. They said, hey, we went to this person's house, we were hanging out, and that was it. And my sergeant major still wanted to, max him out and punish him. And I was like, Sergeant Major, there's no evidence. You can't punish somebody without evidence. Okay, if you still believe in things like due process of the law and that people are innocent until proven guilty. But he was, just hell bent on hemming this guy up. But in the end, there was, couldn't be found guilty because there was no evidence. So similarly, as you're a sergeant major, and maybe many of you have probably already faced this issue, but if you have a sharp complaint and both of the soldiers are in your unit, I would argue that you have a moral responsibility to be fair and objective about the issue until the course of the investigation is run, and Everything's done to try to treat. I mean, they're both your soldiers, and probably many of you have seen today, like in social media and stuff like that, people rush to judgment. Something gets posted, and people are, oh, they're, losing their minds and everything, and then you go do a fact check on Snopes, and oh, that wasn't actually, that never happened, or it was like something that was from like 7 years ago, and no validity to the claim, things like that. But people see something these days, and um, just jump right in and draw a conclusion without really digging in and finding the evidence. Another issue in the Army as a whole is that there have been what I would personally consider a lot of paradigm shifts in the way we view things over the past few decades, since I've been in the Army. For example, hazing. Hazing used to be kind of like rite of passage, and it was not. We're not talking about just abusive, torture hazing, but just kind of scuffing somebody up. The general philosophy that we had was that it was good. We wanted to, and I'm an infantry guy by trade, so we wanted to bring some scunion on people once in a while, new soldiers, kind of get them tough, to prepare them mentally for the rigors of combat and things of that nature. And then eventually the Army changed its minds, like, no, that's not good leadership. And so there's people out there that think, hey, that we need to go back to those days because it makes soldiers tough. And other folks think, no, we need to just, be nice and love on them and everything like that. So there's different ideas, again, about these things, about, what's good, and about how the best way to really care for our soldiers and things like that. There's different ideas. We could all maybe agree that, hey, we want to do what's best for our soldiers, but the practical outworking of that is where ethics and things like that really get into it. So with that said, as you go through and do your research, know, and I mentioned this, I think, in the other video, you don't necessarily have to already have a conclusion drawn about one side or the other. You can do your research, and as you do it and look at both sides of the issue, say, okay, I think this position's stronger, and then write about that, develop your thesis, and develop your points of argument. But please, if you're writing about an opposing point of view, don't demonize or vilify or caricature, make a caricature of an opposing point of view, and don't use a bunch of inflammatory language. For example, hypothetically, if you're going to write about abortion, don't say, oh, people that are pro-choice want to murder children, or if you're pro-choice, don't automatically assume that people that are pro-life are anti-women or against women's rights or anything like that. Most of these issues that you're going to look at are nuanced. They're complex, and so we really want you to get at the analysis by looking at these root causes, what's behind the why behind a lot of these issues and things like that. So that's where we want you to go and spend the majority of your paper really looking critically at those issues carefully, thoughtfully, and then being objective in your presentation of your points. And we want you to evaluate, contrary positions and your own position, even based on, are there logical fallacies, faulty reasoning, moral or philosophical hypocrisy, lack of factual evidence. So those things that you learned in your critical thinking class, those are the criteria that we want you to use when you evaluate these issues. Again, please don't overstate your case. Only make claims and statements that you can support with your research evidence. And keep in mind there's multiple types of evidence. A lot of these issues, when you're dealing with ethical issues, there's historical evidence, there's philosophical evidence, and sometimes there's physical evidence as well, scientific evidence as well. But not everything, I would personally contend, not everything can be proved by science in a lab somewhere. Humans have capacity for kindness and care and self-sacrifice and everything else. We know that. And they also have tremendous capacity for evil and doing things that we would say are objectively wrong. But science can't tell us what we should do. It can, maybe tell us what we're capable of, but it can't necessarily tell us what we should or shouldn't do. I would personally contend that for those things, we have to look to areas like psychology, sociology, philosophy, maybe religion, to really get at those issues about what we should and should not do as human beings. Excuse me. So, with those things said, please recognize that all of us have certain philosophical assumptions about what we believe to be right and true and good in the world. Some people believe when it comes to morality, there's kind of two primary lines of thought. One is that morality is a social construct developed by culture, and some of these folks that are in that camp don't believe that good and evil actually exist at all. That they're merely that those ideas are simply themselves social constructs, and just we only have whatever a society determines if that's okay for that society, and for this one, it's not. Um, and then some people believe that there's objective morality, that right and wrong is grounded either maybe in God or some type of moral law in the universe, or maybe that it's intrinsic. Through the evolutionary process, we've developed a sense of moral reasoning, moral compass that's part of our biology and evolution. Now, at this point, I do want to interject just a couple of my own personal beliefs, just so can see the analysis of how you can kind of get after some of these big ideas and stuff like that if you're going to go there in your paper at any point. So I'm going to say here personally that when it comes to subjective morality, I don't believe that that is a philosophy that can be lived out. And so that would be how I would argue against that. And this is why. So if you believe in subjective morality, you have either two options: one at the individual level or two at the cultural level. But if two people have diametrically opposed beliefs about what's right or wrong, how do you determine whose is correct, whose view is correct? It's at that point it just becomes a subjective personal preference. Like, I like vanilla ice cream. That's my favorite flavor. Now that's a subjective truth to me based on my personal preference. But I don't think that most people can live in a place where they think that morality is just a personal preference, like your favorite flavor of ice cream or favorite kind of music. Most people, in my experience, have believed that morality, that their morals, that other people should hold the same moral points of view they do. And similarly, if you take it on a cultural level, most people can't live there either. Most folks would probably say, that what Hitler did to the Jewish people during World War II, all those horrible atrocities, it was objectively wrong. It wasn't just a matter of, oh, that's fine for their culture, but it's not okay for our culture. So, existential viability. Can you really live out that philosophy? Personally, I don't know too many people that can, and the people that espouse such a philosophy, like Richard Dawkins and some guys like that, if something very horrible happened to them, they were attacked or someone came in and robbed their stuff, they would probably say, hey, that's wrong. It's an injustice. So again, personally, I don't think that that's a philosophy that can be lived out. So that would be one criteria that I would use to look at an idea like that. Another idea that I personally do not subscribe to is the idea that evolution has developed a sense of moral reasoning. I'm not a scientist, but I can understand scientifically how physical properties can be transferred through the biological process. My eye color, my hair color, the physical attributes, height and all that. But I don't understand how that physical properties could transfer abstract concepts like good and bad or right and wrong or anything like that. To me, that would at least have to be learned or I would say personally that yes, I believe people have an innate sense of right and wrong, but it's because we're made in God's image and there's a spiritual dimension to it. So simply biology doesn't provide enough explanatory power, in my view, in my opinion, to rationalize why people have an innate sense of morality. Okay, so those things said, those are just a couple ways that you can look at some issues like that. Again, when you're considering your own beliefs, do you believe that people are intrinsically good or intrinsically bad? And here you kind of get into the idea of nature versus nurture. If you believe people are good, you might cite that the conditions around them are creating, like toxic leadership or something like that is almost forcing them to behave unethically. For example, if there was a lot of recruiters in your state that were being unethical, you could argue that it was, they're just, fell in together and everyone was like, oh, let's just, be shady or whatever. Or you might argue that the amount of pressure and requirements that the recruiting command puts on recruiters is so much, it's so overwhelming, they don't have time to do it all. They're fearful of their career, that they'll get a bad NCOER and their career will be over. So is the Army environment actually causing these folks to behave unethically? That's another way that you can argue, moral and ethical reasoning, the conditions, nature versus nurture. So just another point there for you to think about. You can also kind of look at the outworkings of things, as I said, practical ways, and you can sometimes say maybe things are contradictory to one another, or there's a double standard somewhere that creates confusion. And here I'll give you an example of when the Army reversed its policy on homosexuality. The general, as I understood it, the general argument was that as long as everybody's consenting adults, no problem. Okay, fine. Okay, well, how does that affect the Army's policy on adultery? I mean, the Army hasn't changed its policy on adultery, but if you're in an open marriage and everybody's consenting adult, well, why is it okay over in this area? Everybody's consenting adult, fine, it's not a problem, but over here it's a problem. So you could do some analysis into an area like that. When you get into issues like Sharp and some of those things, determining a person's intent can be difficult. So there's different aspects that you could look at, and make sure you make a distinction between the legal aspect and the ethical aspect and where the two meet. Sometimes some of those areas can be tricky, so be careful. I'm not saying don't tackle them, but just be careful about the claims you're making, things of that nature. Okay, I'm going to try to wrap up here in the next couple minutes. There's other things you could look at, like PTSD, alcohol abuse, marijuana use, for just as an example. We have all these medications and stuff that we give soldiers with PTSD. There's probably some research out there now that marijuana has been legalized in some areas. Does that help soldiers? Is it better maybe than giving them all these pills and things like that? Alcohol abuse in the Army. Is alcohol to some extent still glorified? Is part of being rough, tough airborne ranger and going out and drinking and having a good time? Is that still part of our culture that needs to change? Or is it the stress of the job? There's a lot of different areas that you could look at. One final thing I want to address is, I mentioned kind of my starting philosophical assumptions about objective morality and right and wrong. Sometimes you can address some of those starting theories or something that the Army has adopted. Just as an example, again, in 2016, the Army kind of, as I understood it from the regulation, adopted that theory, again, the primary theory that's out there, that gender is a social construct and not a biological that biological sex and gender are two separate things. Now, when I came in the Army, the two were virtually synonymous. If you said gender or sex, you were essentially saying the same thing. So you could maybe look at, the Army's adoption of that policy. Maybe you think that's a fallacy, that biology does determine your gender, and you could argue against that uh, starting assumption there, or position that the Army has adopted. You can look again deeper at, the Army has a whole bunch of rules and about what's right and what's wrong, but right and wrong according to who. And you can consider social mores also, the things that are in your ethics about, some things that are considered, taboo or something like that in our culture aren't considered weird in other cultures. And they're different and they're considered normal over there. Just for example, like nudity in Europe, they have nude beaches and stuff. It's not a big deal as it is here in the United States. Even words and things that we use. I read a story not that long ago about a missionary, and they went to a different country, and it was an English-speaking country, and it was a lady missionary, and she said, "Oh, I'm just going to plop my fanny over here." Well, in the United States, generally, as far as I know, we use the word fanny to refer to your fourth point of contact, your ham. But in that culture, the word fanny didn't mean you're behind. It meant a certain part of the female anatomy. So those people were like, whoa! They were like, oh, this missionary lady, how would you say something like that? But again, it's just differences. So recognize the nuances of some of the things which are, if you think even back through history, the age of consent, for sexual relationships and stuff like that, different states have different laws, Romeo and Juliet laws. 2,000 years ago, it was, a 15-year-old girl, it was normal for her to be married at that age, 14 or 15 years old when they were physically mature. That wasn't weird. But today in our culture, have 18 generally is the age of consent, but it's younger in some states. So all those different things are things for you to think about, analyze, look, kind of pull apart, make your arguments about why they're good or bad or right or wrong. And then after you do all those, after you do all that analysis, then at the end of your paper you make some recommendations and conclusions based on your findings. So that's about it. I hope this video has been helpful. Like I said, this is like my 7th or 8th take on this video, so I probably used a whole bunch of crutch words, and if I was doing a briefing, I'd only maybe get a passing score, hopefully. But I hope this video helps some of you, and if you have any feedback, I'm open, and thanks a lot.